ASEAN is of great importance for China in its regional diplomacy and a key focus of its Belt and Road Initiative. This was re-emphasized by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang as top diplomats converge in Bangkok for key Southeast Asia summits. With tensions in the South China Sea and the China-U.S. trade war dominating the talks, how should we understand the pressing concerns of ASEAN countries? What results are likely from the Foreign Ministers Meeting? And how will the summits open broader prospects for the development of diplomatic ties? Well, to talk more about these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined by Wang, Dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies at the Beijing Language and Culture University, and Mr. Harvey Zoden, Senior Fellow from the Center for China and Globalization. We'll also be talking to Tan Ki Yap, Co-Director of the Asia Competitiveness Institute at the National University of Singapore via satellite. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Li Xiuyuan sitting in for Yang Rui. All right, I want to start with South China Sea issue first. That has again dominated the meeting this week. We have some old flashpoints in the waters in the past, and the disputes among countries involved are long-running, but we had some recent flare-ups earlier last month when Vietnam accused China of violating its sovereignty by interfering its oil and gas activities offshore. I want to start with you, Professor Huang. How do you respond to Vietnam's accusation?
I think things like this is not unexpected because the two countries do have dispute over some rocks or in South China Sea. But what I want to call your attention is that both sides, both China and Vietnam, try to downplay this skirmish, whatever, on this area. Neither side has made it a high profile, like denouncement or so on and so forth. And if my notice is correct, if my memory serves me right, I don't think Vietnamese government has really made any kind of high-profile, announcement on this. And in China, of course, we don't see it in the media at all. I think that's a good sign because both sides realize that the dispute cannot be solved in the near future, but they want to stay with, stay with it, and they want to downplay the dispute, and which means they still want to, if not solve it, at least manage it in a way that it will not escalate into an uncontrollable crisis.
Yeah, I think we can all agree there is a need to avoid further escalations or avoid complicating the situation even further. But Harvey, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said ASEAN and China have recently finished the first reading of the negotiating text, the draft text of the Code of Conduct. This is long overdue, and we're finally on the right track. Do you think the talks can be completed within 3 years, as promised?
I think it's going to be difficult. But I think that even if they were completed in 3 months, that this code of conduct has many, many problems. It's voluntary. ASEAN works by consensus, or sometimes by consensus minus X. And so for an organization to be administering a code of conduct among the people who are the disputants, let's call them that, I just don't see it working. Maybe it's going to be a good first step, but there's a lot of work that remains to be done. I think a better way, but it's more long-term way, is since the International Treaty on Law of the Sea was promulgated in about 1984, it's time for a revisit. China was in a different position then, as were many of the ASEAN member states. I think it's time to reopen that. Why? Because not only have times changed, but if you look at this region and you look at the disputes, and the one with Vietnam is a good example, this is one of the most disputed areas in terms of the bounties that are in the sea. And it's obvious that there needs to be a better remedy. So I think for many multinational things, it's time to give a seat at the table for people who weren't at the table when these instruments were promulgated.
One of the most disputed waters, that's no doubt. It's also one of the busiest waters, most profiting waterways in the world. But can a South China Sea Code of Conduct really effectively help ensure regional stability?
First, we have to understand the Code of Conduct, COC, is not a solution. It's not to solve the dispute. It's for management. is to try to manage the issue so the issue will not, like I said, escalate into a kind of conflict or confrontations. And so what's really important for COC is not people not to do, to tell people not to do when they dispute, and more than what to do. So I think code of conduct is a kind of multilateral arrangement. Of course, I agree with you, it will not really stop some actions by the dispute, but at least I think it set up a kind of good platform to manage the crisis through multilateral arrangement. On that part, I gave a big plus to it. And of course, let me repeat myself, it's for management, it's not for solution. So how to solve the issue, how to really get to the bottom of the issue and find a solution, I think needs a long-term commitment, and also need the parties involved in the dispute to sit down to really, for goodwill and a good faith, to find a solution down the road.
And just make it clear.
But code of conduct is not for solution, it's for management.
Oh, just make it clear to our viewers, this is not a legally binding document.
And I think, like Harvey said, it's based on consensus. And ASEAN itself, as an international institution, is based on consensus. It's not really rule-based like European Union. It's a consensus-based. Yeah. And also, if you look carefully, ASEAN member countries are not on the same page all the time on the South China Sea dispute.
And
that makes it more difficult.
I think that we're not going to know how well the code of conduct works until it's implemented. And I think we'll learn very quickly if it's a good tool for management or not. I have my doubts, but I think it's worth a try. It's much better than the alternative. Right,
worth a try. Now, Wang Yi also said China is exploring plans to, quote, institutionalize joint military exercises with ASEAN countries in the region after 2 previous drills. Do you see it happening in the future, Professor?
I think I'm kind of positive on this, because there is a need for the country in the region, which I mean the ASEAN member country in China, to have some military cooperations, not for kind of security reasons, but more than for the peacekeeping and cooperation reasons. It's a good start. I think when Wang Yi, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that, I think he must have some certain confidence that at least China, as a major power in the region, want to push that way. And also, we see in the past there were some cooperative operations between China and ASEAN member countries. Of course, it'll be great, in my view, that if they can institutionalize it. But of course, we don't know yet. We have to see what's going on.
We want to bring in our guest from Singapore, Tan Ki Giap, is joining us via satellite. Good to have you with us. Now, the first question to you is this. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo insisted that Washington was not asking Southeast Asian nations to truce between his country and rival power China. Of course, he's not going to say that in public. But what do you think?
Of course, it's good to say that we don't have to choose side. Big countries like China and the United States, they say all this publicly. But I think as an ASEAN member, we rather listen to what they say and watch what they do. I think that's more important. And obviously, ASEAN should not be choosing side, because we are a very vibrant economic communities, and there are foreign direct investment coming in, especially with the U.S. China trade friction. We are seeing more investment, so it is for ASEAN not to choose side and to have a balanced relationship with the major economic powers. And we welcome what he said about not choosing side, but we still want to listen to what they say and watch what they do, whether they are consistent or not.
So, Professor Huang, you heard what Mr. Tan just said. They don't want to choose a side, but it'll be tough for the bloc to maintain a balance between the 2 economic superpowers, isn't it? The traditional comfort of having China as an economic partner, in the meantime having U.S. as a security partner, is becoming less and less convenient.
Yeah, I have to say that I cannot hear a word of what Ki Giap said. Something wrong with my earphone. I try to read his lips, but I know Ki Giap is a machine gun when he speaks. I cannot do that. But I understand your question. I think that ASEAN member country, ASEAN as a whole, is in a crossroad, because on the one hand, it cannot do without working with China in economic development. It has kind of into the orbit of China's development, benefit from it a lot. And China, of course, also benefit from working with Asian countries. But on the other hand, ASEAN member countries traditionally lean towards United States for security. But before, when United States is overwhelmingly dominant in the region, this works, the so-called neutrality works. But now as United States and China get into even shoulder to shoulder, like the power is more evenly distributed, then it's very difficult because both sides, even though Pompeo said he does not ask the ASEAN country to take side, but doesn't mean he does not want them to do that. Doesn't mean the action, the U.S. action is not push them towards that direction. And same for China. China also said we don't want ASEAN countries to take side, but actually China would be unhappy that way, that if they take side. That put the entire ASEAN member countries in a very awkward or difficult situation. Of course, they said they don't want to take side, but that exactly means they're under pressure to handle this kind of rivalry between two major powers in the region. I think that we don't know what they can do yet, but it's more and more difficult. I think the crossroads also because the ASEAN member countries are not on the same line, same page on this issue. Some of them are American allies. By the treaty, they have to work with the United States. But some of them have some historical problems with the United States or some religion problem. So I think that this issue is so important for ASEAN countries, not because they force ASEAN countries to take side or not to take side, but it could break ASEAN if they don't handle this carefully.
Right. And Mr. Chan, at the summit in June, ASEAN leaders adopted an Indo-Pacific engagement framework. What are ASEAN's role? What do you think are ASEAN's role and ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, before that, can I just follow up for what I said? Why ASEAN don't need to choose sides? Because we have to look at what is good for ASEAN in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of regional development. For example, a Belt and Road Initiative is good for regional development. So ASEAN countries welcome that. Singapore welcome it because it is good, not because we choose sides. And we want regional securities, and any effort that disrupt the regional stability, we will go against it. So it's not choosing side, but what is the best for ASEAN? This is what we want to say. Now, about Indo-Pacific, I think it is very clear that ASEAN centrality and also rule-based regulations and international law and transparency, mutual respect, non-intervention in the domestic affair, complementarity with the existing framework, and these are all a very good recipe that has been making ASEAN successful. So this is where we stand when it comes to the Indo-Pacific cooperation framework.
But Mr. Tan, isn't binding Southeast Asia into an American vision undercutting ASEAN's regional influence? Isn't that undermining ASEAN centrality?
No, this is not into the American influence. I just told you that the ASEAN view of Indo-Pacific cooperation framework is based on ASEAN centrality and all the attributes that contribute to the success of ASEAN. And therefore, I think this is good for ASEAN, and we are inclusive. We are open and inclusive. So, and ASEAN has been working on the consensus basis. So no one is being forced into a position if the group don't feel comfortable. So this has been the recipe that has been working for so long. And I don't see why this is falling into the U.S. And I started by saying ASEAN centrality. Obviously, in terms of Indo-Pacific framework, it must be good for ASEAN, not because Americans say it.
Let me put that perspective to Professor Wang here. Mr. Tan just mentioned that the Indo-Pacific vision that ASEAN country just adopted is not about Americans' vision. It is what the ASEAN countries believe in. It's based on ASEAN centrality. What do you think? What do you say to that?
Again, I cannot hear Kit Yas, so I don't know what he said. But my understanding is that ASEAN's Indo-Pacific is fundamentally different from Americans' Indo-Pacific. Because I said ASEAN want to play a leading role, a major role in this region. In other words, ASEAN want to play a role in the development of the entire region, also to connect the so-called Asian Pacific with the Indo-Pacific, where ASEAN is in a very idealistic position. First and second, development rather than security. Last but not the least, of course, ASEAN want to, again, by taking a leading role in ASEAN's Indo-Pacific or Indo-Pacific area as defined by ASEAN. ASEAN try to avoid taking side in this emerging rivalry between the United States and China.
Try to avoid taking side,
Yeah.
but some analysts say, adopting the statement is it's less of a statement of saying that the regional grouping is a player in its own right, but more about keeping on the good side of both Washington and Beijing. It's trying to find a middle ground here, Harvey.
Yeah, of course, and it's very difficult to find a middle ground because it's like China and U.S. are pulling ASEAN member states in two different directions. This is not an easy one to resolve, but the ASEAN member states and ASEAN as a whole has to do what's good for the individual member states as well as for the collective. And so I think that they have a vision of how to do that, and they're going to try to do it. I also think that if China and the other countries who are working on this regional comprehensive economic partnership get together, which is mostly in ASEAN countries and comprises about half the world's population and about 40% of GDP. This is going to be a tremendous thing for the ASEAN countries. I think it's going to free them from the trade war. I think it's going to free them from being pulled in two different directions. So I actually see a bright future for ASEAN, but maybe a few bumps until the RCEP is adopted, as I think it will be.
And I find a quote very interesting. I want to get your take on this. This is from Benjamin Zawacki, the author of the book Thailand, Shifting Ground Between U.S. and Rising China. He says, the increasing tension between Washington and Beijing does afford ASEAN more rather than less influence and room to maneuver, but it is room and influence that ASEAN would rather not have and would choose not to use. He said ASEAN is most comfortable when it has the least influence and room to maneuver, for such provides a ready justification for its indecisiveness, inertia, and utter obsession with neutrality. Is that what you observed?
I think that his words make some sense. Before ASEAN, they don't want to play any high-profile role if there's a rivalry between two major powers. Of course, you can argue that the rivalry between China and the United States may give ASEAN more opportunities to play a role, either as an honest broker or as whatever the balance of weight. But I don't think ASEAN want to do that. So I agree with the author that ASEAN rather not to play such a role. For ASEAN is that when United States engage with China, ASEAN feel very, very comfortable because ASEAN can, again, working with China for economic development, lean towards the United States for security. That's the best situation for ASEAN. But now, of course, you can argue, of course, that ASEAN can kind of work out its own way to promote its own interests. But they have three problems. Number one, of course, is that they can no longer hedging between the two powers if the two powers are head-to-head against each other. Number two, the ASEAN member countries, like Harvey just said, have the individual interest vis-a-vis the collective interest, which is very difficult to handle. And number three, last but not the least, of course, ASEAN member countries are very diversified in terms of level of development and the size of economy in the country. And all of that, of course, will put ASEAN countries in a kind of difficult situation. But having said that, I do believe that if ASEAN can continue this kind of effort or endeavor for economic integration of the region, including China, and Japan, and South Korea, or even India, if ASEAN can successfully push the whole region into that way, ASEAN will benefit from it. And also, if that can be the way to go, it will also, in my view, in the end, kind of relieve some of the pressures ASEAN is feeling right now.
Mr. Chan, joining me from Singapore, I want to give you a chance to respond to what's been said there. What do you think?
Well, I think all these three problems are not problems at all. And ASEAN try on its diversity, and the formula has worked, that we always work as a group for consensus. You look at the RCEP, this is precisely ASEAN-centric, and then we are pushing it, and we are determined to conclude it by the end of the year. So that will be one significant regional trade agreement. So ASEAN, we can work together. We are a successful, united economic and political entity, of course.
Certainly very optimistic, but let me move on to the issue of South China Sea and get your take on this, Mr. Tan. Would a code of conduct that outlines norms and rules relating to the disputed waters in South China Sea work effectively and respond to the needs of the whole region?
Yes, I think the code of conduct is important. The process has started, and it will take longer than what we expected because it's not a simple issue. But I think it's good that we started it. In fact, Singapore wanted the code of conduct to be started a long time ago. And now, apparently, we are working towards some promising conclusion. But I think we should not push for it, but we should take our time and to do what is needed. So if you can't have peaceful and stability in South China Sea, and ASEAN's core interests will be affected. And if ASEAN want to be successful, to be the 4th largest economic entity by 2035, and the prerequisite is a peaceful South China Sea environment. And currently, I think, we have a good opportunities for economic development, with foreign direct investment flowing into ASEAN, and not just in Vietnam, but we're seeing them in Indonesia. And I personally get involved in this industrial park in Indonesia, and in Cambodia, and in Myanmar also, the Irrawaddy township. So I think a lot of excitement is taking place in ASEAN. Therefore, a regional stability, whether it's in South China Sea or Strait of Malacca, and these are very important, including the Korean Peninsula. So I think we're all working towards this peaceful environment. And economic development is the way to go. And the U.S.-China friction actually allows some opportunity for the production value chain to be rearranged. And I think ASEAN, we are ready to receive this change in the production value chain.
I would also talk about the meeting between Wang Yi and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. This is probably the most heavyweight sideline meeting at the summit. This is right on the heels of the trade negotiations between the two countries in Shanghai. Now, Wang Yi said that there is more room for cooperation than differences. Harvey, what do you think of this? How do you view the recent high-level exchanges between the two countries? Do you think they've really made real progress?
I think in the ideal world, there are many more opportunities for cooperation than confrontation. But if you look at the actual facts, it's worrisome because the trade negotiations were restarted and they had maybe the worst possible outcome with President Trump about to impose another 10% tariff on the remaining $300 billion worth of goods. So I think this is a huge problem. And I think the Trump administration talks a good game. But I think, like the speaker from Singapore said, you have to follow what people do, not what they say. I really hope that the Americans would be so problem-solving oriented. But when you're only about America first, you have a very particular outlook that excludes the rest of the world.
Now, Pompeo, immediately after the meeting, painted a rosier picture, tweeting that he and Wang Yi had in-depth exchanges in China-U.S. relations and talked about North Korea, or what we call DPRK, and other topics. But later, he changed his tone, started criticizing China's action in Asia. These include actions in South China Sea and China's dam building on the Mekong River. Yeah. What do you think he's doing there?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I think Mr. Pompeo wants to occupy the moral high ground. That is, we're on the right side, you're on the wrong side. We try to work with you, but you're such a bad guy, you don't deserve to work with us. Look what you did in South China Sea, and so on and so forth. This kind of blaming game, I think, shows exactly that the lack of sincerity and the lack of a kind of really plan to work with each other. Because the grand plan is that to look at China as a strategic competitor or rivalry. And given that, I think when Pompeo said, I really want to work with you, but you have to do this, or but you're such sense. As in that sense, it's not just like Harvey said, it's not what really a cooperative spirit should lead us. And again, it doesn't matter what you say, it matters how you say it. It doesn't matter how you say it, it matters how you do it. And we have to more follow the action rather than what he said. On this point, I do not believe Mr. Pompeo put his mouth where his actions really is.
Now, Mr. Chan, how does ASEAN understand the importance and impact of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership? In what ways does the pursuit of RCEP demonstrate the resolve to safeguard the multilateral system?
Well, let me also touch on what Pompeo says. And there's something which he says very interesting. They say we don't have to choose sides. It's not a zero-sum game. I hope he will understand this better. So the trade war should not be the trade war should not be considered as a zero-sum game. I think ASEAN is big enough for even for U.S. and China to engage in. But if you ask me about RCEP, now I think multilateral negotiation is not easy. And in fact, the RCEP can move parallel with the CPTPP, the Continuous Progress for TPP. RCEP and CPTPP can move together and pathway to FTAP, which is what President Xi Jinping announced in 2013 during the APEC meeting. So we should now try to conclude RCEP, and these are pathway towards the FTAP. And I think the multilateral maybe is difficult, but the FTAP could be another objective that we should look at after RCEP is concluded, since we have already CPTPP, which the U.S. unfortunately decided to drop out. So I think, yes, with this RCEP, ASEAN will be fighting very hard for globalization, for greater trade, and for greater regional connectivity and integration.
Yeah, if formed, this RCEP will see the formation of probably the world's largest free trade area. But Harvey, some worries that RCEP could go the same way as TPP. Remember, the agreement was practically dead after 32 rounds of negotiations over 8 years after Trump pulled out. What do you think?
Well, the speaker from Singapore seemed to think that this is going to be concluded this year. I think that's optimistic. I think that there are some very huge problems. One of them is India. India has a lot of protectionism, and either it's going to have to be temporarily left behind or have to make some gradual deal to deal with their situation. I don't think that that's insurmountable. But I do think that eventually, whether it's next year or the year after, that RCEP will, in fact, become a real cooperative agreement. And I think it'll be a model for the world to go forward with this huge free trade zone.
Right. Professor Wang, your thoughts on this? After 7 years of negotiation, nothing concrete has emerged.
Yeah, it's always more difficult when multilateral engagement like this, because not only you have India, like Harvey pointed out, are quite protectionist in terms of this kind of free trade, but we also have countries at very different levels of development, which also make it difficult. But I want to say that RCEP is quite different game with CPTPP, because RCEP is more about trade or trade terms, how trade tariffs, so on and so forth. But CPTPP is much deeper economic integration, which requires you have certain changes in economic structure to fit in. But having said that, I do believe CPTPP has very positive impact on the region. I do believe that the region overall is working towards a free trade zone. On that, I'm quite optimistic. I also agree with Harvey that once it's done, it will be a very good example, not only because of size, but also because, you know, if so many countries with different levels of development, different political systems, different cultures can work together to create a free trade zone, that is really, really exciting.
And significant. It will also boost trade volumes amid trade protectionism. Yeah. Thank you very much. Good to have your insights, Professor Huang and Harvey Zoden, and Mr. Tan joining us via satellite from Singapore. That is all the time we have for this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.